Did you ask the owner of the house for permission? The question came out of my mouth with a calm I didn't even expect. I had just opened the door to my apartment, with grocery bags still hanging from my arms. And there she was, Claire, my daughter-in-law, standing in the middle of my living room as if it were nothing, with two huge suitcases at her feet and an expression on her face that mixed surprise with something worse. Annoyance. As if I were the intruder. As if my arrival had ruined her perfectly laid plans. She looked up at me, blinked twice, and then let out that uncomfortable little laugh she used whenever someone confronted her. A brief, sharp laugh, designed to make the other person feel like they were being ridiculous. But I didn't look away. I stood there, in the doorway of my own home, holding the heavy bags full of vegetables and cans, waiting for an answer she clearly hadn't prepared. "Oh, hi, Eleanor. I didn't hear you come in." Her voice sounded light, almost musical, as if we were having a casual conversation about the weather, as if the suitcases didn't exist, as if it were completely normal for her to be in my apartment on a Thursday afternoon without having told me, without having asked, without having shown the slightest consideration for the fact that this was my space, my refuge, the only place in the world where I could still breathe without anyone demanding anything from me. I didn't move. I kept standing in the entryway, feeling the weight of the bag starting to mark red lines on my forearms, but I didn't put them down. Something inside me had hardened the exact moment I saw those suitcases. Something that had been soft for years, malleable, always willing to give in, had just found a limit. "I asked you a question, Claire." My voice came out firmer this time. She tucked a strand of her perfectly styled hair behind her ear, that gesture she made when she needed to buy time to think of what to say. Her eyes, painted with light eyeshadow that matched her designer blouse, avoided mine for a second before looking back at me with that small, condescending smile I detested so much. "Eleanor, please, don't overreact. Michael and I just need to stay for a few days. They're doing renovations on our apartment, and the noise is unbearable. The construction crew shows up at 6 in the morning, and they don't leave until 7 in the evening. We can't sleep, we can't work, we can't live like this. We figured there wouldn't be any problem coming here. Besides, you live alone and have 2 rooms you don't even use." There it was. That sentence that summed up exactly what my family thought of me. You live alone and have space you don't use. As if my life were a vacuum waiting to be filled by the needs of others. As if the fact of not having anyone sleeping in the rooms next door automatically turned my home into an available resource for whoever needed it. As if my 68 years of existence didn't give me the right to decide how, when, and with whom I shared my space. I finally entered the apartment and set the bags on the dining room table. The sound of the cans hitting the wood echoed louder than I expected. Claire took a barely perceptible step back, but I noticed it. Her body language had changed. She wasn't so relaxed anymore. The discomfort was starting to seep through that mask of confidence she always wore. I stood by the table, without unpacking the groceries, without moving toward the kitchen, as I normally would have. My hands rested on the wooden surface, and I could feel my own pulse beating in my fingertips. It wasn't fear. It wasn't nervousness. It was something different. It was the feeling of reaching a point of no return. "Does Michael know you're here?" The question was rhetorical. I already knew the answer, but I needed to hear it. I needed to confirm what I already suspected, that my son had allowed this, that he had been part of this plan from the beginning, that they had both decided, together, that my consent wasn't necessary. Claire let out a long, theatrical sigh, as if I were being unreasonably difficult. "Of course he knows. Eleanor. It was his idea, actually. He's finishing up some things at the office, and he's coming later with the rest of our stuff. I thought he would have called you to let you know." "He didn't call you?" "No, he hadn't called." And that silence, that absence of a simple phone call, said everything I needed to know. My son, Michael, the boy I had raised alone after his father disappeared from our lives when he was barely 7 years old, the same one I fed with the salary from my double shifts, cleaning offices and serving coffee at the diner. The same one who used to hug me when he was little and tell me that when he grew up, he would take care of me forever. That same son now considered it perfectly acceptable to move into my house without consulting me, as if I were an extension of his convenience, a resource at his disposal. I walked toward the suitcases. I stood in front of them, looking at them as if they were strange objects fallen from another planet. They were expensive, one of those brands Claire showed off on her social media. Shiny, new, probably bought on one of those trips they took every 2 months while I was still using the same worn-out suitcase I had bought 15 years ago at a clearance sale. And you thought this was okay? Just showing up at my house with your suitcases without asking me if I agreed? Without even considering for a moment that maybe I had plans? That maybe I value my privacy? That maybe I don't want people living here? Claire crossed her arms over her chest. Her posture changed. She was no longer the casual, relaxed daughter-in-law. Now there was defensiveness in every line of her body. Eleanor, you're Michael's mother. We're family. I don't understand why you're making this so complicated. It's just for a few days. A week, maybe. It's not like we're asking for the impossible. Besides, I thought you'd be happy to have company. You're always saying this house feels empty. Empty. That word echoed in my head like a funeral bell. Yes, I had mentioned once that the house felt quiet after my sister Margaret moved in with her daughter last year. But there was a huge difference between quiet and empty. My house was quiet because I chose it to be. Because after decades of noise, of demands, of being available for everyone but myself, I had finally found peace in the stillness. But Claire had taken that casual confession and turned it into justification, as if my moment of vulnerability gave her permission to invade my space. As if admitting I sometimes felt lonely was the same as begging for someone to come fill every corner of my life without asking me first. Listen to me closely. My voice came out low, but firm. Claire stopped moving. Something in my tone made her pay real attention for the first time since I'd arrived. This house can feel however it wants to feel for me. It can be quiet or it can be full of noise. It can be empty or it can be complete. But what it will never, ever be is available for anyone who decides to use it without my permission. I am the owner of this house, Claire. Not a convenient option when you two have a problem. She opened her mouth to respond, but just then, the sound of a key in the lock was heard. The door opened, and Michael, my son, walked in, carrying 2 more bags and wearing that carefree smile he used when he thought everything was under control. Mom, good, you're here. Claire explained things. Right? We're only going to be here a week, 2 at most. You'll see, you won't even notice we're here. I won't even notice they're here. Michael's words floated in the air, as if they were the most reasonable thing in the world. He dropped the bags on the floor next to the suitcases, wiped his hands on his pants, and looked at me with that expression I knew all too well. It was the same face he made when he was 12 years old and came home late after playing basketball with his friends, hoping I wouldn't get mad because, after all, he was just being a normal kid. Except Michael wasn't 12 years old anymore. He was 42. And I was no longer that young, exhausted mother who gave in to every smile because I was too tired to fight another battle. I stood by the dining room table, my hands still resting on the wood, watching him walk into my apartment as if it were his own territory. As if the last 40 years hadn't happened. As if still being his mother meant I had automatically given up any expectation of respect or consideration. Michael came over and tried to give me a kiss on the cheek. I didn't move. I didn't pull away, but I didn't lean in either. I stayed exactly where I was, and he must have noticed something in my posture because he stopped halfway, an expression of confusion briefly crossing his face before it turned into a wider, more forced smile. What's wrong, Mom? Did you have a bad day? A bad day. As if my reaction were the product of a passing mood. As if the problem was that I'd had to wait too long in line at the bank or that traffic had been heavy, not that my son and daughter-in-law had decided to move into my house without consulting me. Not that they had treated me as if my opinion were irrelevant. Not that they had assumed my life, my space, my peace, were resources available for their convenience. I didn't have a bad day, Michael. I had an unpleasant surprise when I got home and found your wife moving in here without anyone asking me if I agreed. Michael let out a laugh, a genuine laugh, as if he'd just heard something funny. He ran a hand through his hair, that gesture he made when he thought someone was exaggerating, and shook his head. Mom, come on, don't be dramatic. I called you twice this morning, and you didn't answer. I figured you were out, and we could get settled while you were back. It's not a big deal. I looked over at Claire, who was now standing by the suitcases with her arms still crossed, watching the exchange with a mixture of discomfort and something that looked dangerously like satisfaction. As if my confrontation with Michael was proving something to her that she already suspected. That I was difficult, that I was unreasonable, that I was the obstacle in a situation that should be simple. You called twice, and when I didn't answer, you decided that was enough authorization to move into my house. We're not moving in, Mom. We're just staying for a few days. Michael moved toward the kitchen, opened the refrigerator as if it were nothing, took out a bottle of water I had bought that very afternoon, and drank directly from it. That small gesture, so insignificant to any outside observer, felt like a confirmation of everything I had been thinking. He saw no difference between his space and mine. To him, my house was an extension of his. My refrigerator, my food, my privacy, it was all part of a shared territory where he had unlimited access. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to control the pressure I felt building in my chest. It wasn't anger yet. It was something deeper, older. It was the accumulated weight of decades of being the person who always gave in, who always understood, who always put others' needs before her own. It was the exhaustion of having spent my entire adult life being useful, available, convenient for everyone except myself. How many days is a few days, Michael? He shrugged, still drinking from the water, not looking at me directly. A week. 2 at most. The crew said they'd finish quickly. It's just until we can sleep in our own bedroom again, without waking up to the sound of drills at 6 in the morning. 2 weeks. 14 days of having 2 people in my space, using my bathroom, eating my food, interrupting my routine. 14 days of not being able to walk in my pajamas in my own living room if I woke up thirsty in the middle of the night. 14 days of having to consider others' schedules before deciding if I could watch my favorite show or listen to my music. 14 days of giving up the peace I had worked so hard to build after years of noise and chaos. And you just assumed I would be okay with that. Michael finally closed the water bottle and looked at me with something that tried to look like patience, but was really barely disguised condescension. Mom, you're my mother. Of course I assumed you'd be okay with it. What did you want us to do? Stay in a hotel and spend $150 a night when you have 2 empty rooms here? That doesn't make sense. $150 a night. There it was, the real truth, naked and unadorned. It wasn't that they needed me. It wasn't that they wanted to spend time with me. It was about money, about financial convenience, about how using my apartment for free was more sensible than paying for their own comfort. And I, as always, was expected to understand, to be reasonable, to put their financial needs above my emotional tranquility. Claire cleared her throat from her spot by the suitcases. When she spoke, her voice had adopted that soft, conciliatory tone people use when they want to seem reasonable while manipulating a situation to their advantage. Eleanor, we really don't want to cause you any trouble. If it's a problem, we can help with expenses. I don't know, maybe an extra $50 for utilities. We're going to be using water and electricity. It's only fair that we contribute. $50. As if the problem was the cost of utilities. As if I could put a price on my privacy, on my routine, on the quiet mornings where I sat on my balcony with a cup of coffee and just existed without having to be a mother-in-law, a hostess, or any other role others needed me to play. It's not about money, Claire. My voice came out more tired than I intended. Michael stepped closer again, this time putting a hand on my shoulder with that gesture he had used 1,000 times when he wanted to soften me up. Then what is it about, Mom? Just tell me what's bothering you, and we'll fix it. You want us to buy the groceries? Perfect, no problem. You want us to clean everything before we leave? We can do that too. You want us to be quiet in the mornings? We'll be quiet as mice. Just tell me what you need, and we'll do it. What I needed was to have been asked beforehand. What I needed was to have been considered, to have been given the right to say no. What I needed was for them to understand that being family didn't mean having automatic access to every aspect of my life without my consent. But how could I explain that without sounding like the selfish mother, the difficult mother-in-law, the unreasonable woman who refused to help her own family in a time of need? I gently moved Michael's hand off my shoulder. Not harshly, but with enough firmness for him to know the gesture was not welcome right now. "What I need, Michael, is for you to understand that this is my home, not a hotel, not a backup option, not an available resource every time you two have an inconvenience. It's the place where I live, where I rest, where I have the right to decide who comes in and who stays. But we're your family, Mom." His response was immediate, almost automatic, as if those 4 words were an irrefutable argument. As if the simple fact of sharing blood nullified any expectation of respect or consideration. And maybe, for a long time, I had believed that. Maybe for years I had accepted that being family meant always being available, always understanding, always willing to sacrifice my own needs for theirs. But something had changed. Maybe it was turning 68 and realizing that time was no longer infinite. Maybe it was the death of my friend Ruth last year, who spent her last days lamenting that she had never lived for herself. Maybe it was simply the accumulated exhaustion of decades of being invisible in my own life. It's precisely because you're my family that this hurts more, Michael. Because I would expect you, more than anyone, to understand that I also have a right to my space, my peace, and my own decisions. Michael exchanged a look with Claire. It was quick, barely a second, but I saw it. It was that look couples share when they believe they're dealing with someone difficult, when they need to present a united front against what they perceive as a common problem. And in that moment, I was the problem. Michael let out a long sigh, the kind he used when he felt a conversation was taking too long to get anywhere. He ran both hands over his face, a gesture of barely contained frustration, and then looked at me with that expression he had perfected over the years. The one of the patient son dealing with a complicated mother. "Fine, Mom. I get that you're upset we didn't give you more notice. You're right about that. But we're already here. The bags are already inside. Claire already unpacked some things in the guest room. What do you want us to do now? Go out and find a hotel at 6 in the evening on a Thursday when I have meetings starting at 7 in the morning tomorrow?" There it was. The guilt, presented not as a direct emotion, but as a series of practical inconveniences that I would be causing if I insisted on holding my ground. As if the fact that they had already started settling in without my permission now obligated me to accept the situation. As if their lack of planning automatically became my problem to solve. I looked down the hall that led to the bedrooms. The guest room door was ajar, and from where I stood I could see a corner of the bed with what looked like clothes already spread out on it. Claire had said she'd unpacked some things. She wasn't asking for permission to stay. She was establishing territory. I walked toward that room. I heard Michael's footsteps behind me, and then Claire's voice saying something to him in a low voice that I couldn't make out. I pushed the door open completely, and what I saw confirmed what I already suspected. It wasn't just clothes on the bed, there were toiletries lined up on the dresser. Claire's makeup bag was open next to the mirror. There were 2 pairs of shoes tidied up against the wall. A laptop was plugged into the only available outlet near the nightstand. This was not the preparation of someone planning to stay for a few days. This was the setup of someone planning to settle in for weeks. I turned to face Michael, who had stopped in the doorway with his hands in his pockets, watching me cautiously. "A week, you said?" He nodded, though his eyes avoided mine for a second before meeting my gaze again. 2 at most. "Mom, I already told you. And all this setting up is for 2 weeks? The laptop, the bath products, enough clothes for a month?" Michael shrugged. That casual gesture he used when he wanted to minimize something he knew was important. "Claire needs to work from here. And obviously, we brought what we needed to be comfortable. We weren't going to live out of a suitcase for 2 weeks. Comfortable. That word echoed in my head. They needed to be comfortable. In my house. In my space. Using my resources. And I, apparently, just needed to be understanding. I walked out of the room and back into the living room, where Claire was now sitting in my favorite armchair, the one by the window, the one I had bought 3 years ago after saving for months. She had her phone in her hand, swiping her finger across the screen with the casual focus of someone with no immediate worries. When she saw me enter, she looked up and offered me another one of those small smiles. "Eleanor, really, we're going to be as little trouble as possible. You won't even notice we're here. I work online, so I'll be in the room most of the day. Michael leaves early and comes back late. We can buy our own groceries if you want. or cook for all three of us. Whatever you prefer, whatever I preferred. As if all these options she was presenting were genuine. As if she were really giving me decision-making power and not simply offering variations of a situation I had never agreed to in the first place. I walked over to the armchair where she was sitting. I didn't say anything immediately. I just stood there, looking at her, waiting to see if she understood what I was communicating without words. She blinked, the smile slowly starting to fade, and after a few seconds, she stood up from the chair with an awkward movement. "Sorry, did you want to sit here?" I didn't want to sit there. I wanted her to understand that every inch of this apartment was mine, that this armchair wasn't an available seat for whoever needed it, but the place where I spent my afternoons reading, where I sat with my coffee every morning, where I had cried after Ruth's funeral, where I had made the decision to finally leave that exhausting job at the diner and accept my retirement. Michael entered the living room at that moment, and the tension must have been visible because he stopped halfway, looking between Claire and me as if he were trying to gauge how serious the situation was. "Mom, can we talk for a second?" "Just you and me," I nodded. Maybe a private conversation with my son would achieve what this group confrontation wasn't. Maybe if I spoke to him directly, without Claire's presence acting as a reinforcement of his position, he could really hear what I was trying to say. We went to the kitchen. Michael leaned against the counter, crossed his arms, and looked at me with an expression that tried to be serious, but mostly conveyed impatience. "Okay, Mom, talk. What's really bothering you? Because I feel like there's something more than just the fact that we didn't call you first. There was something more. Of course there was something more. But how could I explain to my son that what bothered me was the accumulation of years of feeling invisible? How could I tell him that this incident with the suitcases was just the most recent manifestation of a pattern that had been repeating for decades? You bother me, Michael. It bothers me that you've grown up thinking my life is a resource available for when you need me, but not a priority when it comes to basic consideration." He frowned, genuinely confused, as if my words made no sense. "I don't understand what you mean by that. When was the last time you visited me without needing something from me?" The question slipped out before I could stop it. Michael opened his mouth, then closed it, then opened it again without making a sound. He was searching his memory, trying to find an example to disprove my accusation, and the fact that it was taking him so long to find one only confirmed my point. "Mom, I come to see you often. You come when you need me to watch your dog because you're going on a trip. You come when Claire is busy and you need me to hold on to some important documents. You come when you've had a fight with her and need a place to crash for a night. You come when there's car trouble and you need to borrow money for the mechanic. But when was the last time you came just to ask how I was? To spend an afternoon with me? To be interested in my life beyond what I can do for you? That's not fair, Mom." His voice had gotten louder, and I could hear the defensive tone seeping through every word. "I call you. I text you. I asked you last week if you wanted to go to dinner with us. You invited me to dinner because it was Claire's birthday and you needed someone else to help pay the bill. You didn't invite me because you wanted my company. In fact, you barely spoke to me during the whole dinner. You two were arguing about where you were going on vacation next month while I sat there eating my salad in silence. I didn't know you felt that way. Why didn't you say something at the time?" "Because I never say anything, Michael. Because I learned a long time ago that when I say something, when I express that I feel ignored or undervalued, you both make me feel like I'm exaggerating, that I'm too sensitive, that I should just be grateful I was included. So I stopped saying things. I stopped expecting. I stopped believing that my presence in your lives was anything more than functional." He shook his head, running his hands through his hair in frustration. "This is ridiculous. You're turning this into something much bigger than it is. We just need to stay here for a few days. We're not trying to invade your life or make you feel bad. We just need temporary help with a housing problem. And it didn't occur to you that maybe I have a life too? That maybe I had plans for these 2 weeks? That maybe I enjoy my routine and my privacy and don't want to give them up because you two decided to renovate your apartment without considering alternatives? What plans, Mom? What is it you do all day that's so important you can't share your space with your own family?" And there it was. The question that revealed exactly what he thought of my life. To Michael, I didn't do anything important. I had no significant commitments. I just existed in a state of constant availability, waiting for someone to need me to have a purpose. I don't have to justify my days to you. Michael, the simple fact that I want to be alone in my own home should be reason enough. Michael let out a short, humorless laugh and shook his head as if he were dealing with something completely absurd. He straightened up, pushing off the counter, and looked at me with an expression that mixed disbelief and barely contained frustration. So what you're saying is, you'd rather be alone than help your own son, that your comfort is more important than your family's needs. I wasn't saying that. Or maybe I was, but not in the way he was interpreting it. It wasn't about choosing my comfort over their needs. It was about recognizing that my needs mattered too, that I also deserved to be considered, that my life was not a blank space waiting to be filled by the urgencies of others. What I'm saying is that you should have asked me before assuming I would be available, that you should have given me the option to say yes or no, that you should have treated me with the same respect you would treat anyone else you were asking a huge favor of. It's not a huge favor, Mom. It's letting your son sleep in your guest room for a few days. It's giving up my privacy for 2 weeks. It's changing my entire routine. It's sharing my bathroom, my kitchen, my living room, every space where I breathe. It's giving up the peace I worked so hard to find after years of living for everyone but myself. Michael looked up at the ceiling, as if searching for divine patience, and then looked back at me with that tired expression he used when he felt someone was being unnecessarily complicated. You know what, Mom? I think the real problem here is that you've been alone for too long. You've gotten selfish. I'm not saying this to hurt you, but it's the truth. You didn't used to be like this. You always used to have your doors open for me, for anyone. Remember when you let my friend Javier live here for 3 months when his parents kicked him out? Remember when your sister Margaret practically lived here for an entire year? You never said anything then. You never complained about your privacy or your routine. Of course I remembered. I remembered Javier, who was 19 at the time and had nowhere to go after his father threw him out for flunking out of college. I remembered cleaning his dirty dishes every morning, washing his clothes because he never had time, cooking for 2 even though I barely had enough money for 1. I remembered Margaret, my older sister, who stayed with me after her divorce and turned my small apartment into her healing space while I kept working double shifts to keep both our finances afloat. I remembered all of it. And I also remembered how I felt during those times. Invisible, exhausted, resentful, but unable to express it because the people I loved needed me. And I had learned from a young age that women like me existed to be needed, not to need. You're right, Michael. I didn't say anything back then. I swallowed my discomfort and smiled and pretended everything was fine while I faded away a little more each day. I used to believe that being a good mother, a good sister, a good person meant constantly sacrificing myself for others. But you know what? I'm tired. I'm tired of being the convenient solution to everyone's problems. I'm tired of my generosity being taken for granted. I'm tired of waiting for someone, just once, to ask me what I need. But we did ask what you need. Mom, we just asked you a minute ago. We told you to tell us what you want us to do. You asked me what I wanted, after you had already made the decision for me. After you were already settled in, after the situation was already in motion. That's not asking. That's asking for retroactive permission, hoping I'll feel so guilty for refusing that I'll end up giving in anyway. I walked out of the kitchen. I couldn't stay in that enclosed space any longer, with Michael looking at me as if I were the problem, as if my resistance were a character flaw instead of a legitimate boundary. I went back to the living room, where Claire was now standing by the window, arms crossed, watching the street below. She turned when she heard me enter, and for the first time since I arrived, I saw something different in her expression. It wasn't the confidence from before. There was caution there now, maybe even a little worry. Michael came out of the kitchen behind me, and the silence that filled the living room was so thick I could almost feel it pressing against my skin. None of the 3 of us spoke for a moment. We just stood there, forming an uncomfortable triangle of accumulated tension. Finally, Claire was the one who broke the silence. Her voice had lost that casual, confident tone. Now it sounded more careful, as if she were choosing each word with precision. Eleanor, if you really don't want us to stay, we can find another solution. We don't want you to feel uncomfortable in your own home. I looked at Michael, waiting for him to back up what his wife had just said. But he was looking away, his jaw tight, clearly angry about how this whole situation was unfolding. And in that moment, I understood something I probably should have understood years ago. My son was not going to defend me. He was not going to admit they had made a mistake. He was not going to validate my feelings or apologize for assuming my life was at his disposal. Because to him, I was still that mother who always said yes. That mother who moved mountains to make things easier for him. That mother whose love was measured in silent sacrifices and ignored needs, and any deviation from that pattern was not personal growth on my part, but a flaw that needed to be corrected. I sat down in the armchair by the window, the one Claire had abandoned a few minutes earlier. My legs were tired. My whole body was tired. Actually, it wasn't just the physical exhaustion from going to the grocery store or from standing during this endless conversation. It was a deeper exhaustion, the kind that builds up over decades of carrying other people's emotional weight without anyone offering to help you with yours. I want you to explain something to me, and I want an honest answer. Michael finally looked at me, his arms crossed over his chest, in a defensive posture. What do you want us to explain? If the situation were reversed, if I showed up at your apartment with my suitcases without notice, saying I needed to stay for 2 weeks because there's a problem with my building, would you welcome me in without a second thought? I saw the exchange of glances between Michael and Claire. It was fast, barely a second, but it was enough. They both knew the answer. And they both knew the answer was different from what they expected of me. Claire cleared her throat, searching for the right words. Well, we'd have to think about it. Our apartment is smaller, and we both work from home now. It would be complicated with the space and, exactly, it would be complicated. You'd have to think about it. You'd consider your needs, your space, your comfort, and you'd be well within your rights to do so. No one would judge you for protecting your privacy. No one would call you selfish for wanting to keep your routine intact. No one would expect you to sacrifice your peace of mind just because I'm family. But you're my mother, Mom. It's different. Michael had taken a step toward me, his hands outstretched as if he were trying to explain something obvious that I wasn't understanding. Why is it different? Because I'm your mother. Does that automatically mean I have less right to my own life? Does it mean my needs matter less than yours? Does it mean I can be ignored, invaded, taken for granted, because my role is to serve you? I'm not saying that. But you're showing it, Michael. With every decision you make without consulting me, with every assumption that I'll be available, with every time you minimize what I feel because it doesn't fit with what you need me to be. I got up from the armchair and walked toward the suitcases that were still by the entrance. I looked at them as if I were seeing them for the first time. They were physical, concrete objects, but they represented something much bigger. They represented years of unestablished boundaries. They represented decades of teaching my son that my space was his space, that my time was his time, that my life was a shared resource he could take from without asking, and I had been the one who taught him that. I had created this pattern. For years, I had prioritized being the perfect mother, the available mother, the mother who never said no, without realizing that in doing so, I was slowly erasing any expectation of reciprocity or respect. Michael came over and put his hand on my shoulder again, more gently this time. Mom, please, let's not make this harder than it has to be. We just want a place to sleep for a few days. We're not trying to take anything from you. But they were taking something from me. They were taking away my ability to decide about my own life. They were taking away my right to say no without being punished with guilt. They were taking away my ability to exist as anything more than an extension of their needs. I moved my shoulder away from his hand, not aggressively, but with enough firmness for him to understand the gesture was not welcome. This is my house, Michael. I pay the rent. I pay the utilities. I decide who comes in. And right now, I'm deciding that I need you two to leave. The silence that followed my words was so absolute I could hear the ticking of the wall clock in the kitchen. Michael stood completely still, his hand still suspended in the air where my shoulder had been, looking at me as if he hadn't correctly understood what I had just said. Claire let out a small sound, somewhere between a gasp and an incredulous laugh. What did you say? Michael's voice sounded strange, higher than normal, as if the words were stuck somewhere between his throat and his mouth. He ran a hand over his face, took a deep breath, and then looked at me with an intensity I hadn't seen in years. "Mom, please tell me you're joking." "I'm not joking. I need you to take your things and go." Claire stepped forward, her hands raised in a gesture that was meant to be conciliatory but actually conveyed barely contained desperation. "Eleanor, wait, we can talk about this. If we did something wrong, we can fix it. You don't have to kick us out. We're family. Family." That word again, used as a shield, as a justification, as if it were an automatic pass that nullified any need for basic respect. As if sharing blood meant I had to tolerate anything, accept any invasion, forgive any lack of consideration. "It's precisely because you're family that this hurts so much. Because I would expect you, more than anyone, to understand that I also deserve to be treated with dignity." Michael let out another laugh, this one longer, sharper, loaded with disbelief. He turned around, walked a few steps toward the window, then came back, as if the movement helped him process what was happening. "This is insane. You're being completely irrational. You're going to kick us out onto the street? Your own son? Why? Because we got here a few hours before we could talk to you? Because we didn't follow some ridiculous protocol you just invented?" "I didn't just invent anything. Michael, asking before you move into someone's house isn't a ridiculous protocol. It's basic respect. It's what you would do with anyone else in your life. It's what you would expect others to do with you." He shook his head, hands on his hips, looking at me as if he were seeing a stranger. "I can't believe you're doing this. After everything we've done for you." That sentence landed between us like a stone in still water. Everything they had done for me. I waited for him to elaborate, to tell me specifically what this everything he was referring to was. But he didn't continue. He just stood there, breathing heavily, as if those words were argument enough on their own. "Everything you've done for me? Tell me. Michael, help me remember. What exactly have you done for me that justifies me having to give up my peace of mind?" Michael opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked at Claire, searching for support, but she was looking at the floor, biting her lower lip. He looked back at me, and now there was something different in his expression. It wasn't just disbelief or frustration. There was anger there, genuine and growing. "You want a list? Fine. We bought you that new TV last year when yours broke. I offered to pay you for it. You told me not to worry about it, that it was a gift. And then you mentioned it at every family dinner for the next 6 months as an example of your generosity. We took you to the doctor when you sprained your ankle, because I had no way to get there and you were passing by on your way home. And you dropped me off at the hospital entrance. You didn't come in with me. I waited 3 hours alone until a nurse got me a cab to go back. We invite you to dinner every time we celebrate something. You invite me when you need someone else to chip in for the bill, or when you need to look good in front of other people by showing you're good children who include their mother. But at those dinners, you talk to each other, you check your phones, you make plans that don't include me. I'm just there as family decoration." Michael took a step toward me, and there was something dangerous in his movement now. Not physically threatening, but loaded with an emotion that was about to overflow. "You know what your problem is, Mom? That nothing anyone does for you is ever enough. There's always something wrong. There's always a but. You always find a way to play the victim." "I'm not playing the victim. I'm setting a boundary. There's a huge difference. No, what you're doing is punishing me because your life didn't turn out the way you wanted. Because Dad left. Because you had to work hard. Because you feel lonely. And now, when I finally have some stability, when I finally need to ask you for a favor, you decide it's the perfect time to make me pay for emotional baggage from things that happened decades ago." His words felt like physical blows, each one designed to hurt me, to make me doubt, to turn my legitimate boundary into an act of unjustified revenge. And the most painful part was that there was a fragment of truth in what he said. I did feel lonely sometimes. I had carried resentment for years. There were moments when I looked at my life and wondered where all the time had gone, all the energy, all the version of myself that existed before I became a mother, an employee, the person everyone needed me to be. But that didn't change the fact that I had a right to my space, that I deserved to be consulted, That my life was not a territory available for invasion just because my son decided he needed it. You're right about one thing, Michael. My life didn't turn out the way I wanted. But you know what part didn't turn out how I wanted? The part where I raised a son who sees me as a resource instead of a person. The part where I spent so many years being useful that I forgot how to be valued. The part where I convinced myself that love was measured in silent sacrifices and ignored needs. Claire intervened, her voice trembling but trying to sound reasonable. Eleanor, please. We understand you're upset. We understand we made a mistake by not consulting you first. But kicking Michael out, kicking out your own son, is a disproportionate reaction. It's cruel, cruel. That word echoed in my head. It was cruel to protect my space. It was cruel to set boundaries. It was cruel to say no. But it wasn't cruel to show up unannounced. It wasn't cruel to assume my life was at their disposal. It wasn't cruel to minimize my feelings or treat me as invisible. Cruelty, apparently, only went in one direction. Do you know what's really cruel? Raising a son alone for decades, sacrificing every dream I had, working until my hands bled and my back couldn't straighten anymore. All to make sure he had opportunities I never had. And then, when I finally have a little peace, a little space to breathe, to discover that to him, I'm just a convenience. A place to stay when it's cheaper than a hotel. That's not fair. Michael had raised his voice now, and his cheeks were red with contained emotion. I didn't ask to be born. I didn't ask for Dad to leave. I didn't ask for you to have to work so hard. Those were your decisions, your circumstances. You can't blame me for that now. I'm not blaming you for any of that, Michael. I'm blaming you for not seeing that I'm a person, too, for treating me as if my only function is to make your life easier, for coming here today and acting as if my consent didn't matter. He walked over to the suitcases, grabbed one of them with more force than necessary, and looked at me with a mixture of pain and rage that made it hard to hold his gaze. You know what? You're right. We're leaving. I don't need this. I don't need to be in a place where I'm clearly not welcome, where my own mother treats me like a stranger. I'm not treating you like a stranger. I'm treating you with the same standard you treat me without prior consideration. Michael lifted the suitcase, stumbling slightly under its weight, and headed for the door. Claire followed him, grabbing the other suitcase, but before reaching the exit, she turned to look at me one last time. I hope this is worth it. Eleanor, I hope your space and your peace are worth losing your son over. My son isn't lost because I set a boundary. If he leaves and doesn't come back, it's because he chose to value his convenience more than our relationship. It's because he preferred to be angry rather than be wrong. Michael had already opened the door and was stepping into the hallway when he suddenly stopped. He turned around, looked at me with a strange expression I couldn't immediately decipher, and then, to my complete surprise, he let out a laugh. It wasn't a laugh of joy. It was a bitter, sarcastic laugh, loaded with disbelief. This is perfect. Really perfect. Just wait until I tell everyone how my mother kicked me out of her house for daring to ask her for help. Wait until the family finds out about this. Wait until Aunt Margaret finds out that the generous Eleanor, the one who always has her doors open, has now. Wait until Aunt Margaret finds out that the generous Eleanor, the one who always has her doors open, has now become so selfish she won't even help her own son. There it was, the veiled threat. The promise that if I stood by my decision, he would make sure everyone knew what kind of terrible mother I had become. That he would call my sister, my cousins, anyone who would listen, and tell them his version of events. A version where he was the innocent victim, and I was the cruel mother who had abandoned him in his time of need. For a second, I felt the familiar weight of guilt pressing against my chest. That automatic impulse to give in, to apologize, to say it was all a misunderstanding, and of course they could stay. That instinct that had been cultivated over decades of being the person who kept the peace, who avoided conflict, who sacrificed her own comfort to not be seen as difficult. But then I remembered something my friend Ruth had told me 3 months before she died. We were sitting in her hospital room, and she had taken my hand with fingers that had almost no strength left, and she had looked at me with those tired eyes that had seen too much of life. Eleanor, she had said, her voice barely audible over the constant beeping of the machines. The biggest mistake I ever made was worrying more about what people thought of me than what I thought of myself. I spent 70 years trying to be what others needed, and now that I'm dying, I can't remember a single moment when I lived for me. Those words had been echoing in my head since her funeral. And now, standing in front of my son and his implicit threat to destroy my family reputation, I understood that the time had come to decide what mattered more, the image others had of me or the truth of who I really was. Go ahead, Michael. Call whoever you want. Tell them whatever you want. If your version of events is that you asked for permission respectfully and I denied you help for no reason, then so be it. But we both know that's not the truth. We both know you showed up here without notice, assuming my house was your house, treating me as if my consent was irrelevant. Michael dropped the suitcase to the floor with a thud. His eyes were shining now, not with tears, but with pure rage. You know what, Mom? You're right. I didn't ask permission. And you know why? Because I never thought I'd have to ask my own mother for permission to stay in her house for a few days. Because I grew up believing that family helps each other, no conditions. Because you taught me my whole childhood that the doors to this house would always be open for me. I taught you wrong then. I taught you that love meant unlimited access. That being family meant I had no right to say no. I taught you that my space was your space and that my needs mattered less than yours. And now I'm correcting that mistake. Claire intervened again, and now there were real tears running down her cheeks, though I wasn't sure if they were from sadness or frustration. Please, Eleanor, Michael, let's all calm down. It doesn't have to end like this. We can find a solution. We can. There's nothing to solve. Claire, you need a place to stay. I need my space. Those two things are not compatible. It's not complicated. Michael picked up the suitcase again and walked into the hallway, stopping right at the threshold. He didn't look at me when he spoke, and his voice sounded different now, colder, more distant. When you change your mind, when you realize what you've just done, don't expect me to come back as if nothing happened. Don't expect me to forget that you kicked me out when I needed you. I didn't kick you out when you needed me, Michael. I kicked you out when you decided that needing me meant you could ignore me. He walked into the hall without another word. Claire took the second suitcase, but before leaving, she turned to look at me. Her face was red, stained with tears, and there was something in her eyes that looked like genuine confusion. I don't understand you, Eleanor. I really don't. What kind of mother does this? The kind of mother who finally learned that loving herself isn't an act of selfishness. It's survival. She shook her head, muttered something I couldn't hear, and walked out into the hallway where Michael was already waiting for the elevator. I stood in the doorway of my apartment, watching them. Michael's back was rigid, the posture of someone who felt deeply betrayed. Claire was checking her phone, probably looking for nearby hotels. The elevator arrived with a soft electronic chime. The doors opened. Michael got in first, dragging his suitcase with a rough movement that made it hit the doorframe. Claire followed him, and just before the doors closed, Michael looked at me one last time. He didn't say anything, but the expression on his face said it all. Disappointment, rage, incomprehension, and something deeper, something that looked like the genuine pain of someone who felt they had just lost something important. Part of me wanted to run to the elevator, to stop the doors before they closed, to tell them to come back, that I was sorry, that they could stay. That part of me, that had spent decades learning to prioritize the emotional comfort of others over my own. That part that had been trained to believe that conflict was the worst possible outcome, worse even than my own unhappiness. But I didn't move. I just stood there, watching the elevator doors close, listening to the mechanical sound of its descent, knowing that with every floor it went down, I was also closing a chapter of my life. I went back into my apartment and closed the door. The silence that greeted me was different from other nights. It wasn't the comfortable silence of chosen solitude. It was the heavy silence of consequences, of difficult decisions, of bridges I might have just burned. I walked to the guest room, where Claire had started to settle in. The clothes were still spread out on the bed. The toiletries were still lined up on the dresser. The laptop was plugged in by the nightstand, its indicator light blinking softly in the dimness of the room. I began to gather their things. I folded the clothes carefully, though my hands were shaking slightly. I put the toiletries in a plastic bag. I unplugged the laptop and placed it on the bed with the other belongings. I didn't do it out of cruelty. I did it because I needed to reclaim this space. I needed it to stop being the place where someone else had decided to move in without my permission and go back to being simply my guest room. Empty, yes, but empty by my choice. When I finished, I left everything tidy on the bed. If Michael or Claire came back for their things, they would find them ready, respected, cared for, because that was the kind of person I was. Someone who could set firm boundaries without needing to be cruel. Someone who could say no without destroying what belonged to the other person. I went back to the living room and sat in my armchair by the window. Outside, the afternoon was beginning to darken. The lights in the neighboring apartments were turning on one by one, small, illuminated windows in the twilight. I wondered how many of those windows held stories similar to mine. How many women were sitting in their own living rooms, struggling with the weight of having set a boundary. How many were wondering if they had done the right thing. My phone vibrated in the pocket of my sweater. I took it out and saw a text from Michael. Just 3 words. Hope you're happy. I didn't reply, because I wasn't happy. There was nothing happy about what had just happened. There was no victory in having closed the door on my own son. There was no satisfaction in knowing it would probably be weeks, maybe months, before we spoke again. But there was something else. Something that wasn't happiness, but that felt important all the same. There was clarity. There was the certainty that for the first time in decades, I had chosen my own dignity over the comfort of others. There was the feeling that I had recovered something I didn't even know I had lost the right to say no without having to justify myself to exhaustion. Another message arrived. This one was from Claire. Michael is very upset. I don't think he'll call you for a long time. I hope your pride is worth it. My pride, as if setting boundaries was a matter of pride. As if protecting my space was an act of vanity instead of self-care. As if the problem was my resistance and not their invasion. I turned off the phone. Not because I was running from the consequences of my actions, but because I needed silence. I needed to process what had just happened without the constant interference of messages designed to make me feel guilty. I got up and went to the kitchen. The grocery bags were still on the table, exactly where I had left them what felt like hours ago, but had probably only been 45 minutes. I began to put away the groceries, moving on autopilot. The vegetables went into the refrigerator. The cans into the pantry. The bread went into its usual basket on the counter. Every object found its designated place, and there was something comforting in that simple routine. In the midst of the emotional chaos I had just gone through, these small actions anchored me to something tangible and predictable. When I finished putting everything away, I made myself a cup of tea. I heated the water. I chose my favorite mug, the light blue ceramic one I had bought at a local market years ago, and watched the leaves slowly expand in the hot water. The familiar aroma enveloped me, and for the first time since I had opened my apartment door that afternoon, I felt like I could breathe completely. I sat down in my armchair again with the mug between my hands. The warmth of the tea seeped through the ceramic and warmed my palms. Outside, night had fallen completely. The city continued its constant rhythm, indifferent to the small drama that had just unfolded in my 6th-floor apartment. And then, without warning, I began to cry. They weren't dramatic sobs. It wasn't the heartbroken wailing of someone who had just lost something irreplaceable. They were silent tears that simply ran down my cheeks as I sat there, holding my tea, looking out at the darkness beyond the window. Tears that had been waiting decades for their turn to fall. I cried for the mother I had been, that young woman who worked double shifts and came home so tired she could barely stay awake to help Michael with his homework. I cried for the years I had spent convincing myself that constant sacrifice was love, when in reality, it was just fear. Fear of not being enough. Fear that if I didn't give myself completely, my son wouldn't love me. Fear of ending up alone. And now here I was. Alone anyway. But it was a different kind of loneliness. It wasn't the result of abandonment or rejection. It was the consequence of having chosen my own dignity. And although it hurt, although it felt as if I had lost something important, there was also a strange sense of relief. Like when you finally drop something heavy you've been carrying for so long you'd forgotten what it felt like not to carry it. I remembered a specific moment from when Michael was 8 years old. It had been a particularly difficult day at my job at the diner. A customer had yelled because his order took too long. My boss had reprimanded me for something that wasn't my fault, and I had come home with my feet so swollen I could barely walk. Michael was in the living room watching TV when I came in. "Mom," he had said without looking away from the screen. "I'm hungry." I had dropped my bags by the door, taken off the shoes that were pinching my aching feet, and gone straight to the kitchen to make him something to eat. I hadn't even sat down first. I hadn't even taken a moment for myself. Because that's what good mothers did. Good mothers put their children's needs before everything else. But what was I really teaching him with that behavior? I was teaching him that women existed to serve, that mothers had no boundaries, that saying, "Give me a moment or I'm tired," was selfishness instead of basic self-care. And now, 34 years later, my son had grown up believing exactly that. It wasn't entirely his fault. I had been his most consistent teacher in that mistaken lesson. Every time I had ignored my own needs for his, every time I had smiled despite being exhausted, every time I had pretended everything was fine when I was actually falling apart inside, I had taught him that I didn't matter as much as he did. And he had learned the lesson perfectly. I took a sip of my tea. It was cooling down, but the familiar taste comforted me anyway. I thought of Ruth again, of those last conversations we'd had in the hospital. She had been so brave at the end, facing death with a brutal clarity that only comes when there's no time left for comforting lies. "You know what's the saddest part, Eleanor?" she had told me one afternoon while I peeled an orange to share with her. "It's not that I'm dying. We all die eventually. The sad part is that I spent my whole life waiting for the moment when I could finally live for myself, when the kids grew up, when I retired, when I had more money. When, and now that moment is never going to come because I've run out of time." She had squeezed my hand with a surprising strength for someone so frail. "Don't make my mistake. Don't wait until it's too late. If you need to say no, say it. If you need space, take it. If you need to choose yourself, do it. Because no one else is going to do it for you." I finished my tea and left the empty mug on the side table. I sat in the silence of my apartment, listening to the distant sounds of the city. A car passed on the street below. Someone laughed in one of the neighboring apartments. Life went on, indifferent to my small, personal revolution. My phone vibrated again. This time it was a message from my sister, Margaret. Michael had already called her. Of course. The news of what I had done was already circulating through the family. "Eleanor, what happened?" "Michael called me very upset, saying you kicked him out of your house. He says they only needed to stay a few days. Is it true? Call me when you can." I could perfectly imagine that conversation. Michael presenting himself as the misunderstood victim. Margaret, always so diplomatic, trying to understand both sides, but probably leaning towards sympathy for Michael because, after all, he was the kid of the family. And I would be painted as the difficult mother who had suddenly become selfish in her old age. I should have felt angry at the prospect of being misunderstood. I should have wanted to call Margaret immediately to give my side of the story, to defend myself, to make sure everyone understood I wasn't the villain in this story. But I realized something important. I didn't care as much as I thought I would, because the truth was that Margaret, despite being my sister and loving me in her own way, had never really understood why I had let her stay in my apartment for an entire year after her divorce. She had never acknowledged the sacrifice that had represented for me. She had assumed, like everyone else, that I had space to spare, and time to spare, and energy to spare, because that's what women like me had. Leftovers of ourselves to hand out to whoever needed them. I wasn't going to call her, at least not tonight. Maybe tomorrow. Maybe the day after. Or maybe never. Maybe it was time to let people think what they wanted to think. Maybe it was time to stop wasting my energy trying to control the narratives others built about me. I got up from the armchair and walked to my bedroom. As I passed the guest room, I glanced inside. Claire's things were still there, tidied on the bed. I would have to call Michael tomorrow to tell him he could come by and pick them up whenever he wanted. But that was a problem for tomorrow, not tonight. In my room, I changed slowly. I put on my most comfortable pajamas, the soft cotton ones that were a little worn but felt like a hug. I washed my face, brushed my teeth, followed every step of my nightly routine with deliberate slowness. Each action was a silent affirmation. This is my space. This is my time. This is my life. I got into bed and turned off the light. The darkness enveloped me, and with it came a thought I hadn't expected. Relief. Pure and simple relief. I wouldn't have to wake up early tomorrow to the noise of other people moving around my apartment. I wouldn't have to share the bathroom or wait my turn to make coffee. I wouldn't have to moderate my behavior or consider the needs of others before deciding what I wanted to do with my day. But along with the relief came the weight of the pain. Because my son was angry with me. Because there was a rupture in our relationship that I didn't know when or how it would be repaired. Because I had chosen my peace over his comfort, and that choice had consequences I would have to face. I allowed myself to feel both things at the same time. The relief and the pain. The certainty of having done the right thing and the sadness of the consequences. The strength of having set boundaries and the vulnerability of not knowing what came next. I closed my eyes and let sleep come gradually. Before I fell completely asleep, I had one final thought. Maybe this was what it meant to truly grow up. Not when you formally became an adult, not when you had a job or a house or even a child, but when you finally learned that loving yourself wasn't selfishness, it was responsibility, it was justice. It was the only way to live with integrity. And with that thought, I finally let myself go to rest. I woke up the next day with the sunlight streaming softly through my bedroom window. For a moment, in that hazy space between sleep and wakefulness, everything seemed normal. But then the memory of what had happened the night before came rushing back like a cold wave, and I lay there staring at the ceiling, slowly processing the fact that I had kicked my son out of my house. I got out of bed and went through my morning routine, just as I always did. I went to the bathroom, washed my face with cold water, brushed my teeth. Each familiar action helped anchor me to the present, to remember that life went on despite yesterday's emotional drama. But when I left my room and walked toward the kitchen, I couldn't help but look toward the guest room. The door was still ajar. Claire's things were still on the bed waiting to be claimed. I made coffee. The rich aroma filled the kitchen as I got out my favorite mug and waited for the coffee maker to finish its work. I poured myself a cup, added a splash of milk as always, and sat by the living room window. Outside, Friday morning was in full swing. People were walking to their jobs. Kids were on their way to school. The world kept spinning, completely oblivious to the small personal earthquake I had experienced. My phone was on the table where I had left it the night before. I turned it on with some apprehension, knowing there would probably be more messages. And I was right. 3 more from Margaret, each more insistent than the last. One from my cousin Tanya, asking if I was okay, and one from Michael that simply said, "I'm coming by this afternoon to get our things. You don't need to be there if you don't want to." I read that last message several times, trying to decipher the tone behind the words. Was it consideration? Was it coldness? Was it his way of giving me an out, of allowing me to avoid an uncomfortable confrontation? I wasn't sure, but what I did know was that I was not going to hide in my own home. If Michael was coming to get his things, I would be here. I replied with a simple, "I'll be here. Ring the bell when you get here." I spent the morning cleaning. Not because the apartment was dirty, but because I needed to keep my hands busy. I vacuumed the entire living room. I wiped down the kitchen counters until they shone. I changed the sheets on my bed, even though I had just changed them 3 days earlier. It was physical therapy, a way to process the whirlwind of emotions still churning inside me. Around noon, I finally decided to call Margaret. Not because I felt I owed her an explanation, but because she was my sister, and despite everything, I cared what she thought. I dialed her number and waited as it rang. "Eleanor? Thank goodness. I've been worried all night." Margaret's voice sounded genuinely distressed, and something in me softened a little. Margaret. I'm sorry I didn't answer sooner. It was a difficult night. Michael told me what happened. Well, he told me his version. I want to hear yours. At least she hadn't automatically assumed Michael was right and I was wrong. I mentally thanked her for that before I began to explain the situation. I told her about the suitcases in the entryway, about how they hadn't consulted me, about the conversation we'd had and how it had escalated until I finally asked them to leave. Margaret listened in silence, interrupting only occasionally with clarifying questions. When I finished, there was a long pause before she spoke. I understand why you felt that way, Eleanor. I really do. But don't you think maybe you reacted a little strongly? It's Michael. It's your son. Surely you could have found a way to resolve this without getting to the point of kicking him out. There it was. The answer I had been expecting. That subtle suggestion that I had exaggerated, that I had taken things too far, and maybe she was right. Maybe there were other ways to handle the situation. But I also knew that if I had given in, if I had allowed them to stay after they showed up without asking, I would be teaching Michael yet again that my boundaries didn't matter. I didn't react strongly. Margaret, I reacted appropriately. Michael is 42 years old. He's a grown man with a stable job and enough resources to pay for a hotel. He decided it was more convenient to use my space without consulting me. That's not okay, no matter how much I love him. But that's how families are, aren't we? We help each other when there's a need. We don't ask permission every time we need something. I should have known Margaret would say something like that. She had lived with me for a year, after all. And during that time, I had never charged her rent. I had never asked her to contribute significantly to expenses. I had never put a time limit on her finding her own place. I had been the generous, available, understanding sister. And now that I was setting boundaries, I must have seemed like a hypocrite. Do you remember when you lived with me after your divorce, Margaret? There was an uncomfortable silence on the other end of the line. Of course I remember. You were so generous to let me stay. Do you know why I never asked you to leave after a few weeks or even a few months? Margaret didn't answer immediately, and I continued before she could. Because I was afraid. I was afraid that if I set boundaries, if I asked you to find your own place, you would think I was selfish, that I didn't love you enough, that I was a bad sister. So I swallowed my discomfort and my need for personal space, and I let you stay because that's what good sisters did. Eleanor, I didn't know you felt that way. You never said anything. Exactly. I never said anything, and that was my mistake. Because by not saying anything, I taught everyone around me that I had no boundaries, that they could take whatever they needed from me without worrying about the cost to me. And now, after decades of doing that, I'm finally learning to use my voice. And it hurts. It hurts to set boundaries. It hurts to disappoint people. But it hurts less than continuing to disappear in my own life. Margaret sighed heavily. I don't know what to say, Eleanor. I understand what you're saying. I really do. But Michael is very hurt. He's saying he's not going to talk to you for a long time. That's his choice. I'm not punishing him. I'm just protecting my space. If he decides that's reason enough to cut contact with me, then that says more about him than it does about me. We talked for a few more minutes before saying goodbye. The conversation hadn't ended badly, but it also hadn't left me with the feeling of being completely understood. Margaret was a product of the same generation as me, raised with the same expectations about what it meant to be a good woman, a good mother, a good sister. It was hard for her to understand why I was rejecting those rules now, after having followed them so faithfully for so long. At 3 p.m, the doorbell rang. I got up from the couch where I had been reading, took a deep breath, and went to open the door. On the other side was Michael, alone. No sign of Claire. He was carrying 2 large duffel bags, probably to pack up the things they had left. Hi, Mom. His voice was flat, emotionless. It wasn't hostile, but it wasn't warm either. It was the voice of someone fulfilling an awkward obligation. Hi, Michael, come in. He moved past me without making eye contact and went straight to the guest room. I closed the door and stayed in the living room, unsure if I should follow him or give him space. I finally decided to stay where I was, but I kept the guest room door in sight. I could hear him moving around the room, opening and closing drawers, the sound of zippers on the bags. It took him about 10 minutes to pack everything. When he came out, he had both bags slung over his shoulders, and his expression was still that carefully neutral mask. He stopped in the living room, halfway between the bedroom and the exit. For a moment I thought he was going to say something important, that maybe this was the opportunity for a real conversation. But instead, He just nodded toward the hallway. "Can I use the bathroom quickly before I go?" "Of course." He left the bags by the door and went into the bathroom. I heard the water run, the familiar sound of someone moving through a space they knew well. And in that moment, the reality of what I had done hit me. Not the part about setting boundaries or protecting my space. That still felt right. But the part about how my son, my only son, now felt like a stranger in the house where he had grown up. How he had to ask me for permission to use the bathroom. How the distance between us had grown so vast in just 24 hours. He came out of the bathroom and picked up the bags again. He headed for the door, and I followed him. He opened the door, stopped in the threshold, and finally looked at me directly. "Is there anything you want to say, Mom?" There were so many things I wanted to say. I wanted to tell him I loved him. I wanted to explain to him one more time why I had to do what I did. I wanted to ask him if we could ever go back to having a relationship where I was seen as something more than a convenient resource. But what came out of my mouth was something different. "I love you, Michael. I will always love you. But I am no longer going to sacrifice my well-being to avoid your discomfort. If that means we spend time not speaking, then so be it. But the door will always be open for a relationship where we both respect each other." He nodded slowly, as if he were processing my words. He didn't say he loved me too. He didn't say he understood. He just nodded. "Goodbye, Mom. Goodbye, Michael." The door closed behind him with a soft click that echoed much louder than it should have. I stood in that same spot for several minutes, staring at the closed door, listening to the absolute silence that filled my apartment. There were no footsteps in the hall, no voices, just silence. I walked back to the living room and sat in my armchair by the window. My hands were shaking slightly, so I clasped them in my lap and took a deep breath, trying to calm the racing of my heart. I had done it. I had held my boundary even when my son had come to pick up his things with that hurt look on his face. Even when every motherly fiber of my being wanted to run after him, apologize, beg him to come back. The following days passed with a strange slowness. I woke up each morning and went about my routine. Coffee, shower, breakfast. But everything felt different now. There was a weight in the air, a constant awareness that I had broken something, though I wasn't sure if what I had broken was my relationship with Michael, or just the dysfunctional pattern we had maintained for decades. Margaret called 2 more times that first week. On the second call, her tone had changed. It wasn't just worry anymore. There was something else there. "Eleanor, I've been thinking a lot about what we talked about when I lived with you after my divorce." I heard her take a breath on the other end of the line, as if gathering courage. "I never properly thanked you for that year. I never acknowledged what you sacrificed to give me space. I just assumed you were fine with it, because you never said otherwise. But I should have asked. I should have been more considerate. I wasn't expecting that apology. I felt something loosen in my chest, something I didn't even know was tight. Thank you for saying that, Margaret. It means a lot. Maybe you were right in what you said to Michael. Maybe we've all just taken it for granted that you'd always be available, that you'd always say yes, that you'd never have needs of your own." 2 weeks passed before I got the next message from Michael. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even a conversation, just a photo. It was a picture of him and Claire in front of what looked like their renovated apartment. The text said, "Renovations are done. We're back home." It didn't mention anything about what had happened. It didn't ask how I was. It was a cold, factual message, the kind of update you'd send to a distant acquaintance rather than your mother. But it was something. It was a thin thread of communication, and I decided to take it for what it was, a small first step. I replied, "I'm glad you're comfortable in your space now. Take care." There was no response after that. Days turned into weeks. I went on with my life. I went to the market on Thursdays as always. I met my friends for coffee on Tuesdays. I read books I had been putting off for months. I spent entire afternoons sitting on my balcony just watching the city, something I had never allowed myself to do when I was always waiting for someone to need me. And slowly, very slowly, I began to notice something. The guilt I had been carrying, that constant feeling that I had done something terrible, began to lessen. In its place, something different appeared. It wasn't happiness, exactly. It was more like peace. Like the feeling of finally setting something heavy on the ground. After carrying it for so long, your arms had forgotten what it felt like to be free. A month after the incident, I was at the market picking out tomatoes when my phone rang. It was Michael. A real call, not just a text. My heart sped up as I looked at his name on the screen. I put the tomatoes back in their bin and moved away from the crowd a bit before answering. Hello? Hi, Mom. His voice sounded different, sober. It had lost that defensive edge it had the last time we spoke. How are you? I'm okay. And you? There was a long pause. I could hear background noise, maybe traffic, as if he were walking down the street. I've been thinking a lot. About what happened. About what you said. I didn't say anything, waiting, giving him space to continue. You were right, Mom. Not about everything. I still think you could have handled it differently, but you were right about the main thing. I showed up without asking. I assumed you'd be available because you always have been. And that wasn't right. I felt something loosen in my chest, something that had been tight for weeks. Thank you for saying that, Michael. Claire and I have been talking. She says she's always felt that I take you for granted, that I treat your generosity like it's an obligation instead of a gift. And I think she's right. I listened to the words coming out of my son's mouth and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Not the naive hope that everything would go back to the way it was because I didn't want it to be like it was, but the hope that maybe, finally, we could build something new, something more honest. I appreciate you telling me this. I know it wasn't easy. Mom, I'd like to have lunch. Just you and me, without Claire, no pressure. Just to talk. Would you like that? I surprised myself by smiling. I'd love that. We arranged to meet the following Saturday at a small restaurant halfway between our apartments. When I hung up, I realized tears were running down my cheeks, but these were different from the ones I had cried that first night. These were tears of relief, of gratitude, of the possibility of healing. Saturday arrived and I found myself nervous in a way I hadn't been in years. I changed my clothes 3 times before settling on a simple brown dress that made me feel comfortable and dignified at the same time. I got to the restaurant 5 minutes early and waited at a table by the window. Michael arrived exactly on time. He looked different, too. There was something in his posture, in the way he approached the table, that was humbler than before. He sat down across from me, and for a moment, we just looked at each other. Hi, Mom. Hi, son. We ordered food, and at first, the conversation was clumsy, full of awkward pauses. But gradually, as we ate, the words began to flow more easily. Michael told me about his work, about the problems they were having with one of his projects. I asked him about Claire, and how she was handling the stress of her own job. And then, between the main course and dessert, Michael put down his fork and looked at me directly. Mom, I need to tell you something, and I need you to just listen completely before you respond. I nodded, feeling my stomach tighten with anticipation. My whole life, I've seen you as my mother first, and as a person second. I never stopped to think about who you were, beyond what you did for me. And that was selfish. It was unfair. And I'm sorry. His voice broke slightly on the last few words, and I saw that his eyes were wet. When you kicked me out of your house, I was furious. I thought you were being cruel, that you were punishing me for something I didn't understand. But after weeks of thinking about it, of talking with Claire, of even talking to a therapist I started seeing, I realized something. I realized I have never once asked you what you need. I've never considered that your life doesn't just exist in relation to mine. And that has to change. Tears were streaming freely down my face now, and I didn't try to stop them. I don't need you to be the perfect mom who always says yes to everything. I need to know the real person. Eleanor, not just Mom. And if that means you sometimes tell me no, that you sometimes set boundaries, then I accept that, because I'd rather have an honest relationship with you than keep living in this pattern where I take and you give until there's nothing left of you. I reached my hand across the table and took his. It was warm and shaking just a little. Thank you, Michael. You don't know how much it means to hear that. We spent the next 2 hours really talking. Not the superficial conversation we had kept up for years, but a real conversation about who we were, what we needed, how we could have a relationship that worked for both of us. It wasn't perfect. There were awkward moments, difficult admissions, truths that hurt to say. But it was real, and that was infinitely more valuable than the false harmony we had maintained before. When we finally said goodbye at the restaurant door, Michael hugged me. Not the quick, obligatory hug of family gatherings, but a real, long hug, the kind of hug that says, I see you, I value you, I love you for who you are, not just for what you do for me. The following months weren't perfect. There were setbacks, moments when Michael would fall back into old patterns of taking my availability for granted. But the difference was that now I had a voice, and he was learning to listen. I learned that teaching your children respect doesn't end when they grow up. Sometimes the most important lesson comes when you finally say no, when you finally set the boundary you should have set years ago, when you finally choose yourself without apology. Because being a mother doesn't mean being invisible. It doesn't mean sacrificing every part of yourself on the altar of maternal love. It doesn't mean your house, your time, your life are resources available to whoever needs them without your consent. Being a mother means loving deeply, but it also means teaching your children that real love includes respect, that healthy relationships have boundaries, that you too are a person with needs, dreams, and the fundamental right to decide about your own life. That Thursday afternoon, when I found the suitcases in my entryway, was not the end of my relationship with my son. It was the beginning of a new one built on honesty instead of obligation, on mutual respect instead of one-sided sacrifice, on true love instead of the dysfunctional patterns inherited from generations that taught us women existed to serve. And when I sit now in my armchair by the window, with my cup of hot coffee in my hands, looking at my quiet, tidy apartment, I feel something I haven't felt in decades. Pride in having chosen myself. Pride in having found my voice. Pride in having taught my son that love doesn't mean the absence of boundaries, but the presence of respect. My house is still my house. My life is still my life. And I, Eleanor, at 68 years old, am finally the owner of both.